so what does adolescence mean to you as a sort of developmental period? I guess given all your work on sort of social relationships and the sort of wider context of children and young people, what does this sort of period of development mean?
I think it's a really interesting question because actually this is a kind of contested notion. There isn't like a fixed definition. Adolescence is a period of our life development. It's a part of our life course. And there's a biological aspect to it. You know, we've got the hugely important marker of puberty, of course, but it's also a social life phase as well. And that means that it's variable across different social and cultural contexts. So if you're to look in one country versus another country, maybe even within one country, you look at different subcultural groups, you'll actually see differences as well, because different things are happening in the social lives of young people. I mean, broadly speaking, as I said, we can map it onto the onset of puberty, but there's so much more going on. The other thing I'd bring up about this is that it's also something that might change historically within a culture as well, because it is a social construction to some extent. Actually understanding what adolescence is, what it means, what's happening during adolescence is inevitably going to be different over the course of history. And I think there's some really interesting questions to ask about what is adolescence like now compared to what it used to be. You know, I'm a psychologist, as you pointed out, and I think quite often we're quite bad at history. We tend to think about what we're doing in the here and now. And I think it's really important to take that interdisciplinary perspective and really think about the historical context to all of this. But yeah, I mean, I think it's just a hugely important social life phase with a range of different biological processes taking place. Very much, we can think of it as being a transition, putting it very casually, as a transition from childhood towards a kind of emerging adulthood as well. But there's a lot going on.
That's great. That's really, really interesting. I mean, I just want to pick up on one of your points about sort of, you're talking about how there's been sort of historical changes, and whether you can sort of pick up that point a little bit more around sort of what recent changes we've seen in this period in terms of, I guess, sort of the pressures and challenges and opportunities faced.
I mean, you know, the standard things people will be talking about now are like social media and body image and mental health pressures, and of course society structures as well, like what are the opportunities available to young people in terms of their educational development, in terms of jobs, in terms of owning property. All of those kinds of things change historically as well, and young people are living through that at this very moment. I think one of the things to bear in mind is that we're still learning about adolescence. If you look at developmental psychology research over the kind of last 100 years, adolescence hasn't received all that much attention throughout that time. And we're still learning a lot now in the last sort of 20 or 30 years, still learning so much about this period of time in young people's lives. Like I said, there are the biological processes associated with puberty, but there's been a lot coming out over the last, 15, 20 years about the neuroscience of adolescent development as well. We know that there are really quite important changes in brain development which are taking place during the adolescent years. And that also influences our kind of understanding of what's going on for adolescents. When you couple that with the changes in our society in terms of the social pressures that are on young people, in terms of the challenges that they're encountering in terms of things like social media, in terms of the audience that young people have for all of their social interactions online, you realize that actually there's a lot going on that we need to dive into.
Great. That's really interesting. Again, I guess a follow-up question to that would be, based on your work or any that you know about how young people feel about this label of adolescence. How do they usually sort of react to it? I know Mike's not on the call anymore, but I mean, I'd be interested in hearing from him. But I mean, just based on your work, how young people sort of react to this label, because as you say, it is socially constructed in a way.
It is socially constructed, and it would be great to have Mike's point of view if he's able to come back in. I mean, my own perspective on it is that there are a lot of not exactly contradictions, but dissonances in relation to adolescence. Like, on the one hand, it's supposedly the time when young people are kind of growing up, maturing, being expected to make decisions for themselves, take responsibility for their actions, and so on. So you've got that side of it, that idea of very much moving towards adulthood, maturing in that way, having more ownership of their lives. And yet at the same time, there's a kind of a social pressure around control and surveillance and making sure that people aren't doing silly things, dangerous things, unsafe things, being responsible in those decisions. And to me, that balancing act is really, really hard for adolescents. And I think the word adolescence itself gets colored by that dissonance. It gets colored by that desire for people to, on the one hand, feel confident about making their decisions autonomously, being in charge of themselves and being kind of, in quotes, more grown up about things. And yet at the same time, a real fear about leaving young people to those decisions because there's a concern that actually they might make bad decisions or unsafe decisions. So that sort of balancing act, I think adolescents are very much caught in the middle of that. And I think the whole term adolescence has that very kind of in-betweeny feel to it, which is by its very nature quite unsettling.
Yes, yeah, definitely. I think that's the sort of, we're all sort of nodding in agreement there, Alice and I. I was just wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit more around some of the work that you've done on sort of peer influence and sort of the social context, and whether there's anything of relevance there to this particular period.
I think there's a lot happening in this period in relation to peer relationships, which is so important for us to try and understand. And again, I was talking about adolescence as a whole period being to some extent neglected within the history of developmental psychology research. The peer relations context is another neglected part. And yet for me, it's like a window onto the mental health and well-being of young people. Our relationships matter to us. They make a huge difference to how we feel about ourselves, how we feel about the world. And so, when I was saying that some of the pressures at the moment historically are around evidently rising concerns relating to mental health, you've got to turn to relationships and recognize that, of course, during adolescence, the peer relationships occupy particular significance. They're particularly prominent in adolescence. And we know that there's a sort of a changing dynamic. Obviously, it starts much earlier, but there is a changing dynamic during adolescence in relation to family processes and peer processes. So if we were to zoom in and think through what's happening on the peer level, you've got quite an interesting developmental trajectory. So probably during the primary school years, as a young person, as a child, is making their way through the primary school years, especially as they get towards the second half of the primary school years, we know that social group acceptance becomes more and more important. The kind of self-presentation, how am I looking to other people? How do I come across to other people? How are other people evaluating me? How are they thinking about me? That becomes more and more important. And that continues right through into adolescence. That concern with social evaluation, doing the right thing, fitting in, making sure that I'm keeping up, trying to ensure that the image that I'm presenting to other people is going to be accepted, is going to be valued, is going to be seen as positive. Those are really important things, right? And that will be continuing all the way through adolescence. And we know for sure, sometimes that tips over into very significant anxiety when people feel like they're desperate to make those positive impressions, but for whatever reason feel unable to do it or feel very unconfident and feel anxious about the way it's being received by other people. So we know that that in itself is a challenge. But in adolescence, you've got this other aspect of it as well, which is development of intimacy, development of really mature, genuine, authentic relationships with other people, which are founded on a kind of self-disclosure, really sharing with other people, feeling that you've got confidence in your life that you can really connect with. And even as I'm talking now, I'm sure you can appreciate what that challenge must be like, because on the one hand, it's about maintaining your image, your public image, and I mentioned social media already. That's gonna accentuate it, isn't it? It's going to really put the pressure on in terms of getting the image right, because you're going to be seen very publicly by a large audience online. So you've got that, and you've got this, of course, perfectly normative development around developing intimacy with other people, really developing close, caring relationships with other people, which are founded on interpersonal connections that are quite deep and really carry a lot of emotional baggage with them as well. You put those two things together and you realize, actually, that is a very, very big ask for a young person, right? Coming into secondary school, throughout secondary school, and moving into the community more widely as well, moving into the world of work in the early 20s, you might be going on into further education. It might be a case of making the first steps into work environments. Actually, what you're doing at that time in terms of your relationships with the people who are your age, your peers, is actually really complex. And we know that some young people handle that much better than others. What can we do as professionals working with them to support that? That's the kind of approach that I try to take in my work.
That's really, really fascinating. Really, really interesting. Alice, I don't know if you had anything else to add on to that question or following up.
Yeah, I think I was kind of interested, we've touched on social media a little bit and how the kind of concept of adolescence is quite socially constructed. I was wondering if you've kind of sort of seen anything, felt anything, how that's changed what it means to be a young person, to be an adolescent, and how that's potentially changed how kind of society views this period and how we talk about adolescence, if there's anything to say about that.
Well, it's a great question, Alice. And I think, again, it's not a single answer. I think we're holding multiple things in mind at the same time when we think about this concept, this construct of adolescence. Because on the one hand, we're thinking about people who seem to be, if I can put it this way, growing up too fast. You know what I mean? That you've got young people who are being exposed to stuff online, entering into interactions with other people in ways that make the sort of previous generations of childhood and adolescence seem crazily innocent and crazily disconnected from the realities of the world, right? Realities of the adult world. You've got that on the one hand, but then on the other hand, you've also got this sense, and again, it comes with the territory of what I was saying about brain development, recognizing that there's actually still an awful lot of brain development happening even into late adolescence, even into the early 20s, right? You've also got, at the same time, this sense that actually there's still a lot of dependence there as well, and a need for a lot of support, and a recognition that actually, yes, in one sense, they're growing up too fast. That might be a perception among a lot of people. But at the same time, a feeling that, gosh, they're not as mature as they were, as I was when I was that age. There's that kind of really odd contradiction that a lot of, I think, adults will hold about young people. And I think that's a really difficult position for adolescents to be in themselves. Because it kind of goes back to that dissonance that I described at the beginning about, on the one hand, being expected to be grown up and even being perceived to be very, very grown up, but at the same time being perceived to be, actually, you're nowhere near proper adulthood. And that's a very difficult position.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I think it's come up in a couple of your answers, that this idea of adolescence as being quite a difficult period in managing these multiple transitions, managing these different kind of viewpoints. And I wonder what you think about, you touched there on adolescents kind of needing support. I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit more, and the types of support that they might need. It's
a really interesting question. I don't have the answer for it. I don't think it's a kind of a magic solution. I guess what I'd do, Alice, I'd go back to what I said right at the beginning, which is that relationships matter. So we need to think about the network of relationships within which each individual adolescent is embedded. I think one of the challenges in psychology, and psychologists I think are very often guilty of this, one of the challenges we often see when we think about the difficulties that a young person might be having is we tend to individualize. We tend to regard the challenges that are occurring for a young person, the difficulties they're exhibiting, as sort of residing inside that one individual young person's head. So you see, like in the context of doing work on mental health, right? This is the area of work that I'm very much involved with as a psychologist. In the context of doing work around mental health, it's very commonly we'll be thinking, okay, let's work out a good screening protocol so we can identify which young people have difficulties or are at risk of difficulties, and then figure out what interventions do we need to put in place in order to support those young people. So nothing wrong with that, right? Of course, we want to identify young people who are experiencing difficulties or might be at risk of that, and then put in place strategies to intervene. But subtle nuance here, when we're doing this, quite often we inadvertently tend to perceive the difficulties as being very specific to that one individual person, as if it's like a property of that person, a characteristic of that person. Whereas I often think the unit of analysis is wrong. The question shouldn't be what's going on inside that one young person's head. It shouldn't be just that. It should be what's going on in the relational network that that young person is embedded within. What is that young person's social world like? What are their relationships like? And so when you think about supporting a young person, to me, it's not plucking a young person out of their social world, being seen by an expert therapist and being done to, right? Having some intervention done to them. It's actually about understanding what their social life is actually like. What is their network of relationships actually like? And finding a way to be empathetic, to have an insight into that social life, and to work with the young person as the architect of their own developmental trajectory. And that, to me, is how you actually have some kind of integrity in working with young people, by enabling them to be the architects of their own development, that they have the agency in developing their own life course, and that what you're doing is you're providing an empathetic support that is really couched in an understanding of their relational network.
That's great. Really, really interesting. I wonder how much, I know you've done quite a lot of work in schools and a bit in children's social care. I wonder what is your kind of perception of how well services, systems that adolescents kind of go to, how well they're doing that at the moment, or where the kind of main sort of issues are with that.
Okay. Let me put it this way. I think it's very variable. Okay. I've seen really, really good practice, but I've also seen situations where I think, gosh, we could have a very different approach here. And quite often when you think about support for young people, especially young people who are facing particular adversities or vulnerabilities, it often becomes a very sort of, like I said, individualized, problem-oriented deficit model, where it's like identifying what's wrong and then finding some way to fix what's wrong with some expert external help. And I always think like we're missing something really important here, because the good practice that I've seen, the really good practice, and I have seen lots of that in schools, in social care services, and in other settings as well, the really good practice focuses not just on understanding what's going on inside that young person's head, but it also thinks about the environment. What is this place like? Not just what's happening for this young person, but what is this place like? In the case of a school, I'd be asking, actually, what is the school environment like for everybody who's here, including the young person who's dealing with various different risks or adversities? How do we create an environment which is genuinely health promoting? How do we create an environment where the relationships, the social connections are valued in their own right, recognizing that the well-being and the mental health of the whole community really matters. And to me, that's not just about a young person with difficulties, it's about every young person. And frankly, it's not just about every young person, it's about every person in that environment. It's about the staff as well. It's about the adults in the environment. It's about the connections with the families and the community as well. So it's really recognizing that whole school community approach. And I think that that's the kind of good practice that I've seen in many places, but it's definitely not like everywhere. And there's still a long way for us to go in that regard.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's really interesting, Robert. Just a quick follow up on that. And I know you were talking a lot about the sort of, thinking about an individual in terms of their social relationships. But I was wondering where, in your model, where the structural issues come into play. So, for example, social deprivation or poverty. Do they fit into that model that you're talking about as well?
Absolutely. And that's part of it. So it's not just about an individual's relationships with the other individuals around them in their lives. It's also recognizing the societal structures that might be, for example, not providing the same opportunities for a young person in one place compared to in another place. Absolutely, the structural factors are important. I think we all know that there are real structural inequalities in our society. I think that's been exposed by events over the last few years in a way that's been very powerful and I think has affected a lot of people powerfully. But of course, it's not like this is new stuff. Actually, this is something which is very much part of our history and is still there. So when we're thinking about ethnicity, when we're thinking about socioeconomic advantage or disadvantage, when we're thinking about gender, when we're thinking about sexual orientation, all of those different protected characteristics, of course, we all know that there's a real intersectionality connecting all of them and that some young people may be marginalized and lacking in opportunities in multiple ways. So, I mean, just hearing myself talk at the moment, I'm just increasingly conscious, gosh, we've got a huge challenge on our hands because it's not just about the mindset of how we approach our, the settings that we're responsible for. It's not just about our community as a whole. It's actually about society and its structures. Obviously politics comes into that as well. And that could be a whole nother show, right? We could have a whole separate discussion on that.
No, I completely agree. Yeah, and I don't know if we want to go down that rabbit hole in the time that we've got left. I don't know if Mike hasn't seemed to have come back on, unfortunately. But I know he wanted to ask a question around risk taking and sort of, I guess, risk taking by young people. And I think he was wanting to ask around how key professionals and professionals around adolescents and young people, how they should think about risk taking. Which I thought was a really interesting question, actually.
It's a really interesting, it's very much in line with what we've been talking about, right? Because it's that whole issue of growing up, taking more autonomy, making decisions for yourself, and yet at the same time, you've got that dissonance, right? Of people feeling, well, hang on a second, can we really rely on young people to make good decisions? Are they going to be safe? And there's so many examples of young people actually making very unsafe decisions as well. So we've really got two things which are clashing against each other. And I should say as well, this is one of the areas where you can really look at what's happening in terms of the brain development to understand what's going on here. Because we know one of the things that people have become much more sensitive to is recognizing that the developments, particularly in the prefrontal cortex, around planning, around impulse control, around weighing up different factors to make decisions, all of that is continuing to develop right through into late adolescence. Right, like I was saying, in the early 20s, there's still developments in those areas. And you've got that on the one side. And then at the same time, we know that there's a greater sensitivity within the development of the brain in relation to pleasure, in relation to stress. So you've got on the one hand, this high level of emotional intensity, both positive and negative emotions. You've got that coupled with a still developing system in terms of planning, impulse control, decision making, and so on. And you realize actually this may be why there is that anxiety here, because we've got young people who are growing up being told they can make decisions for themselves, that they've got to take responsibility, and yet there's a feeling that, but they're still developing. Now, I actually think it's a little bit of a red herring. I really think all of that is a bit of a red herring, because the truth is that we all are continuing to develop throughout our whole lives, right? The life course development continues in many ways. So I'm not a neuroscientist. I'm not going to go into the neuroscience in detail around specific ages at which different things are happening. But what I want to say is that the way in which we process what's going on in our world, right? How we process the information of our social interactions, how we process the connections that we have with other people, and what happens in a given on a given day with another group of people, all of that is just part of being human. That starts right at the beginning, right? This is not just, it doesn't immediately come very abruptly in adolescence. That's been happening from day one, and it continues throughout the whole of our lives. So the question I always try and frame is, what kind of an environment are we creating within which young people are making these decisions? What kind of an environment are we creating within which young people are handling and managing and addressing these different risks? And I think that the issue that we've got to really think about is to move away from a model which is just focused on control, however well-intentioned that might be. However well-intentioned it might be, like it might be motivated fundamentally by keeping safe, right? It might be motivated by safety. But I think we've got to move away from a model which is about control, because that is going to be a poor fit to the developmental needs of adolescence. Because the developmental need of adolescence is going to be based around developing autonomy. We've just talked about that. So it can't be control. It's got to be about being with the young person as they're handling this quite challenging terrain. They're navigating this challenging terrain. And I think a really good example of where that comes through is in the literature on parental monitoring. So if you think about what's the responsibility of parents in relation to a young person's behavior, quite often people will talk about parental monitoring as a kind of a protective mechanism against things like delinquency or unsafe behaviors. And the logic of that might move you towards a greater control. Like, we need to do more surveillance, more monitoring of our young people. We need to know what they're doing, who they're with, where they're doing it, right? And actually, the literature on parental monitoring is much more nuanced than that, because it's not just about surveillance. In fact, it's not really about control and surveillance at all. It's creating an environment where young people actually initiate the disclosures, where they feel that they can trust the people around them to be able to share what's going on in terms of their decision making. So that's the kind of in my opinion, two-way communication that needs to be happening. It's not about saying that we need to control, we need to be monitoring the young people in a sort of surveillance format. It's about creating an environment where young people feel that they're able to approach and get support in an empathetic way from the from the adults around them, in order to make these very challenging decisions around risk.
That was so interesting. It's such a good response. Honestly, I could have had you talk about that all day. But I mean, I think that sort of future focused thing that you were talking about there is really interesting. And I was wondering, I mean, I guess just thinking about and sort of looking to the future, some of these other concepts that come up in your work around, I know you were talking about sort of agency there, but around concepts of kindness and well-being, and how do you sort of build those into sort of not just sort of service design, but into the relationships that young people have with professionals as well?
This is a very difficult question, actually, Jordan. It's a really difficult one, and that feels counterintuitive, right? Because whenever I tell people I'm doing work on kindness, people say, oh, that's so nice. But it also feels like it's just this really lovely, fluffy, simple thing. Oh, let's all be nice to each other. And honestly, I think this is like the most difficult thing to do in terms of organizational planning, in terms of setting up professional services, frankly, in terms of any workplace as well, right? So this isn't just about children and young people. This is about everybody. It's the hardest thing to do. How do you create an environment which feels kind to the people who are in it? It's really tough. It's not something that can be engineered. It's not simply about having something that feels like all the policies are absolutely clear and laid out and are being applied fairly to everybody. Right? Because that's our instinct, I think. Our instinct is to say, well, let's just make it completely fair for everybody. Let's make it completely equal because we're going to lay everything down and we're going to make sure that we follow the policies, follow the procedures, and then everything will be clear. Everyone knows what they're doing. And surely that's the best way for people to be able to feel like they're being treated fairly. And it's like, yeah, kind of. But does it really feel like a kind environment? And again, there's a little bit of a sort of a opposition here because you might be in the system which feels like everything is laid out really well and people are treated fairly and we've got policies to make sure that people are kept safe and we're treating people in exactly the same way, and yet it just doesn't feel human. Right? Sometimes people in an environment like that might be feeling like, actually, I don't feel like anybody's relating to me as a human being. And so I'm kind of setting up the problem, Jordan, rather than giving the answer, okay? I think the task for every one of us working in professional services, when we're thinking about creating a sort of a workplace environment or structuring our service for adolescents or indeed anybody, I think the task we've got to ask ourselves is, how do we create an environment which has all of those sort of safeguarding processes, it has all of that policy around equality, it has all of that sense of fairness and people being treated equally, but also feels kind, where people feel genuinely motivated to support others, to help others, to comfort others, to be honest with each other. And to my mind, it all comes down to the word I used before, relationships. It all comes down to the relational network. What are we actually doing to foster empathetic, kind relationships? And the thing is that this is not something that we have no sense of. We all have a really good intuitive sense of kindness. We all know what it feels like when someone's kind to us, right? And we all know what it feels like when someone's unkind to us, that's for sure, right? So we have a very intuitive human sense of people being motivated by that other focused concern, where they're transcending themselves, they're stepping outside of themselves, and you really can feel that they're caring for us. What the task is now, I think, perhaps more important than ever before, is thinking through the environments that we're creating, going beyond the sort of the rational policy-making approach and thinking, how do we create a human environment where people feel that those relationships are being valued, where that in itself is important. And I think that when we're working with adolescents in whatever setting, whether it's in a school setting or out of school setting, a community group, whatever it might be, or indeed in terms of supporting families as well, what we've got to work out is, how do we create an environment where those relationships are really felt to matter?
That's great. Again, thank you, Robin. Alice, I don't know if you had any other follow-up questions before I open up to Seth and Bev, because I'm sure they will have something to ask.
I think it's absolutely great, I think. I just wanted to ask, you mentioned earlier that some of the schools that you've worked in have kind of got a sense of this approach of building this kind of relational way of working. And I was wondering if you had any kind of comment on the difference that you can see that making for for the school and for the young people in that environment and the other people that work there.
It's really interesting, actually. We've done quite a lot of work around schools which have really woven work on social relationships into the fabric of the whole school community, where all the staff are involved. It's not just about the pastoral team. It's not just about the wellbeing service. It's actually about everybody at the school, the people in the canteen. It's about the math teacher, the drama teacher. Even if they don't have an official responsibility for pastoral work with the young people, they know that it's their business as well, because they're human beings in an environment with other human beings. And I think what I've seen is that young people, first of all, in those environments, of course, there's highs and lows, right? People have positive and negative experiences every day. But broadly speaking, young people report, and this is what our research has shown, young people report more positive social experiences. They feel there's a stronger connection with the other people around them in that environment. And really interestingly as well, and this could be a whole separate topic for discussion, really interestingly as well, what we also find is that young people seem to do better in terms of their academic achievement as well. And I find that absolutely fascinating because, I've been working in this area for a long time, and quite often I encounter people where they're feeling like, okay, if I'm spending time on well-being or kindness or social and emotional skills, that's taking time away from the academic agenda. And what is shown again and again is that it doesn't work like that. It's not a trade-off. Actually, these things go hand in hand with each other because learning is a social process as well. Learning is affected by our emotional state as well. So what I'm seeing in the schools where the good practice is there is that the relational focus is going absolutely hand in hand with the commitment to learning, with curiosity, with motivation around achievement as well. So I think that's a really important message to get out there.
Yeah, great. I mean, I think it's the potential of that, I think, as you can see from what you've just said, is huge. Thank you. I don't know, Seth, Bev, if you want to add any questions in.
Yeah, please. Thank you. That was fascinating. I've got lots of questions and I'm wondering where to go, but I mean, maybe I could give you a choice.
Okay.
Or I really don't want to go on a negative, but you've said so much positive, great stuff. And I just wondered, first of all, I was going to ask you, where have you seen the good practice, to give us an actual example? But Alice's question spoke to that a bit, and you said when the whole team. But I'm wondering about hearing about the non-education young people. And I'm also wondering about hearing about the effects of trauma, particularly at that prefrontal cortex planning, impulse control, decision-making time, when it's also the pleasure-stress moment. I just wonder if you could tell us maybe about the effect of trauma that impairs that development in the way that it probably would, perhaps.
Again, it's a great question, but you know what? I'm going to be referring to some of the same concepts, actually, because they really are interconnected. And Seth, your question around the negatives, I think, is really important, because there's absolutely no doubt about it. We've got some young people going through life facing enormous adversity and dealing with the most challenging circumstances you could imagine. And it's not simply a case of let's boost the well-being and let's improve all the positives, because there's some really big negatives to deal with as well. Having said that, I think that one of the things that I would really caution against is assuming that when we're dealing with young people who experience significant adversity and trauma, that the focus really is just on remediating the deficits. I mean, obviously, there's going to be a really important task of remediating the deficits in terms of keeping young people safe. Obviously, that's important. But actually, I think more than ever, there needs to be a focus on building on the positives as well. And I really think this is an important thing to bear in mind. So we've done a lot of work over the years with young people who are in care. And one of the things that we've focused on is actually trying to challenge the view of young people in care as being one which is wholly negative, because it's not true. There are some incredibly powerful, inspiring, and positive messages for young people in care. And we need to be able to tap into those, understand those, and of course, not assume that that's going to be the case for everybody, but to say again, what's the environment which we're creating for that young person? How are we working with that system of relationships in order to give that young person the best chance, not just to not have the level of difficulties that they had before, but actually to flourish? So I talk a lot about resilience as a kind of a process, not just something that sits inside a young person's head, just as much as the mental health difficulties don't reside in a young person's head. Resilience also isn't just a character trait. Resilience is a social process as well. It's about creating an environment which supports a young person through the challenges that they're navigating as well. And I'll give you an example. I mean, we found in our research most recently that it's actually the combination of self-efficacy and also positive best friendships, positive peer relationships. Those two things combined together predicted resilience, predicted well-being, specifically among young people who are in the care system. It's not different to anybody else. Those things really matter. The relationships really matter. The feelings about themselves really matter. And those in turn are going to be undoubtedly shaped by the environment that they find themselves in. Now, the question you started with, Seth, was about outside of the educational context. I have to confess, most of my research is in the educational context. The one thing I would say, however, is that I've been doing a lot of work recently outside of the educational context with young people through creative arts and through sports as well. And that's been absolutely fascinating to see for me, because it's been like me getting out of the usual territory that I'm in, which is generally schools and colleges, and actually seeing young people in a different environment. And in fact, we've done a lot of work with young people who are at risk for various different reasons, facing a lot of adversity in their lives, really engaging with the arts and with sports in ways that are transformative for them. And why is it transformative? What's happening in those environments? It's the same thing. Their self-development is happening. They're feeling it. They're able to understand themselves and express themselves. And they're doing that in a supportive, empathetic, relational context. So I feel like what I've been talking about, even though most of my research is in an educational context, I hope they're speaking to some real fundamentals that are important, whatever context you're looking at.
One thing then, thank you, that is really beautiful. But what would you say might be, if you could kind of do the key ingredients of what sustains that empathy in that environment, what would they be?
It's always difficult to think about like one key ingredient.
Or a number of them. I mean, obviously you've said so much about it being relational, but I think I'm kind of trying to grasp, but you know, we're not all architects, interior designers, and we're talking about creating environments.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering what it is that might be a universal trait that will kind of be a guiding way of everyone being able to create those environments you're talking about.
Okay. So, I mean, what I was going to say, but I wasn't very happy with this answer. What I was going to say at the beginning was just making sure that the value is placed on the relationships, because quite often what other people, what a lot of people think about quite spontaneously in this area is that the relationships are like a means to an end. Like we're building a relationship in order to do X, Y, and Z. And I think that sort of transactional approach to relationships, I think young people see through that immediately. Right? They see through that. So valuing relationships in their own right and recognizing that they're central, they're not just a means to an end, having those relationships recognized to be important in young people's lives for their own sake, I think is really important, is a crucial ingredient. But as I was saying, as I was thinking that's a really wordy and long-winded way of expressing it. So, okay, all right. So I guess if I was to try and distill it, right, this is, again, not rocket science. If I was to try and distill it, what I'd say is trust. It's got to be trust. Because actually, I think that notion that actually these relationships matter for their own sake, that they're important in their own right, I think what that comes down to is trust in each other. And that doesn't happen overnight, right? That doesn't happen in families overnight. That doesn't happen in schools overnight. But it's something that can be nurtured. Even when there's a lot of flux, even when there's a lot of change, we have to create the conditions wherein people feel that they can trust in the relationships that they have with other people.